Hi, it's Brendan here. Before we kick off with my interview with David Goodhart, I want to tell you about Spiked Supporters, our online hub for regular donors complete with exclusive perks. From now on, those who give £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year will be able to comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to live events, get a discount on all items in our shop, and bookmark articles as you browse in your very own Spiked Supporters account. This is all our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us. We're really grateful for that. Regular donors who already give £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year are already eligible to join Spiked Supporters. And if you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and set up your Spiked Supporters account. Thank you all from everyone at Spiked. And now, on with the show.
The parties of the left have become overwhelmingly graduate-dominated amongst their activists, their MPs. They've all had a relatively similar experience. And I think that's weakened them as a political force. The two main political parties have swapped in this respect, actually. University used to be for rich people, so the Tory party would have many more graduates than the Labour Party. But actually one of the advantages to the Tory party, I think, amongst its membership is less graduate-dominated. Absurd though it seems, they're actually sort of closer to the pulse of the country because they haven't gone through this politicisation that university invariably produces.
Hello and welcome to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill. This is a podcast in which an esteemed guest joins me to talk about the big ideas, the bad ideas, the problems and the controversies of life in the early 21st century. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by David Goodhart. David is a journalist, commentator and author. He founded Prospect magazine in the UK and he was director of the think tank Demos. He currently works at Policy Exchange. David has made a name for himself as a contrarian liberal thinker, especially on the issues of immigration and diversity. He is the author of The British Dream, Successes and Failures of Post-War Immigration, and The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics. His most recent book is Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century. David, there's lots I want to ask you about, but I want to kick off by talking about your latest book, which has been out for a while, Head, Hand and Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, in which you essentially argue that there is a dominant cognitive elite which rewards and values people who work with their heads far more than people who work with their hands and their hearts. And this has given rise to a pretty warped society, a warped value system, and a sense of alienation among large sections of our communities. So for listeners who haven't yet read your book, but obviously should, could you just give a brief overview of what you mean by those three categories of head, hand, and heart, and what you think has happened to them in recent times?
Yeah, the meaning is in the title, as you say. I mean, head, hand, heart. I'm looking at this is really the kind of second book in a series. My first book, The Road to Somewhere, about the new political tribes. I coined the phrases anywhere and somewhere for the two different value groups in Britain, divided amongst other things by educational status, and this book burrows down deeper into that educational divide. But I mean, head, hand, and heart is obviously a kind of artificial distinction in some ways. Everything we do is a combination of the kind of cognitive and the emotional and the embodied, but nonetheless, you can broadly speaking look at a labour market and see areas, certain categories of jobs that are primarily about manipulating information in various different ways. The cognitive jobs tend to be dominated by graduates. Then there are jobs that may require more specific vocational type qualifications. Technicians, IT technicians would have been skilled manual workers in the old days, fewer of them these days. The skilled trades, plumbers, electricians, and so on. A lot of those jobs classified these days as the kind of missing middle, particularly in this country, because we've sent so many people to university and have and have rather historically abandoned those kind of higher vocational qualifications. And then the heart category is referring more to caring occupations, I mean, both in kind of education and health, occupations that require a degree of emotional intelligence, patience. I mean, many of the kinds of things actually that we associate with being a parent in some ways. The responsibility of care, or a parent or a primary school teacher, or more obviously a nurse, I guess. But obviously, I mean, one of the rather annoying criticisms made of the book, because actually I do say it several times in the book, is that I was creating these artificial distinctions, and almost all human actions, let alone jobs, are a mixture of the three, obviously. Nonetheless, it is worth emphasizing that. I mean, perhaps one of the kind of almost model jobs of the future is unfortunately a dementia nurse. To be a dementia nurse, you're going to you don't necessarily need a degree, although probably many dementia nurses in the future will have degrees, but you're certainly going to have to have studied this illness, this appalling illness, in considerable detail and understand how it operates. But you're going to need to combine that sort of academic book-based knowledge with the patience and care of a loving parent or a really good nurse. So we're going to get all sorts of odd combinations between these categories. But and my basic argument is that I mean, the first part of the argument is really rather an obvious one. I mean, the whole sections of labour market economics underline it, that we've had this great return to qualification. We've had this great increase in the proportion of people who have been encouraged to develop their cognitive skills. The people who have passed exams at school have gone to more or less good universities, have had more or less successful professional cognitive careers. And that's become, I argue, too much the kind of gold standard of human esteem, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years. And moreover, that it's been associated with a kind of single ladder to a successful life, that, that ladder is into a good university. And I think a lot of people, as you rightly said in your brief introduction, I think a lot of people feel that their own contributions have been devalued, and they have literally been devalued. I mean, as you've, it's one of the kind of laws of labour market economics in recent decades, that this higher return to qualification, and that's obviously been an incentive for more and more people, even people who are not actually particularly academically able to try and climb that ladder. Obviously, the better off you are, the more your parents come from that sort of background, the easier it is for you to climb the ladder. And people from that background, I mean, people from a variety of social backgrounds, although obviously biased, as in so many other respects, towards the middle and upper middle class, so many people from those backgrounds who have got onto that treadmill and have gone into academic universities, have completely dominated our cultural life, our political life, our economic life for the last two generations, one might say. And that group, I mean, this is where the book perhaps overlaps a bit with my previous book. That group tends to have certain biases. I mean, they're perfectly decent biases, but they are biases. I mean, anywhere priorities for openness, autonomy, mobility, particularly in this country, because our universities are overwhelmingly residential universities. So people going to university often join a whole new class. I mean, they uproot themselves from their town, from their family, from their friends, and join. It's almost sort of like the old monastic system. And indeed, it stems from the traditions of Oxford and Cambridge, which were kind of monastic institutions originally.
That's a very useful overview of what the book is about. Very good description of it. And I'll prompt you on further with another question in that case. So what you do very well in the book, you describe very well the way in which you understand the differing values that are attached in contemporary society to those who are primarily cognitive in what they do. As you say, there is a mix of head, hand, and heart in pretty much every job. But those who are primarily cognitive not only are they valued more in terms of the esteem that is attached to them, the way in which they're talked about in political circles and media circles, but also in terms of their pay. So you describe how the pay of, for example, a public relations manager has risen quite a lot over the past few decades, whereas the pay of a bus driver, which is an issue close to my heart because my dad was a bus driver when he first came to this country 50 years ago, their pay has risen by a much smaller amount. You give a very tangible overview of how this hierarchy has been created. But I want to ask you how you think this has come about, how you think we have come to be in a society that values certain forms of work and contributions more than others. So is it down to deindustrialization and the fact we live in a post-manufacturing world to a certain extent, and therefore the value that was attached to working men and working women in the past has changed? Or do you think there's a more conscious tribal view which says that we are the good people, we are the clever people because we run society, we are the experts, and you guys, you're important, you do good work, but you're not as important as us? So where would you put the dynamic in terms of how this shift has come about?
Well, I think it's always been there. I mean, what's changed in the last 30 or 40 years is it's been sort of massified. You go back, I mean, the cognitive has always been elevated above the physical, you might say. I mean, go back to Plato. I mean, Christianity reinforced it in many ways. The physical is corrupt and inconstant, and the purity of the spirit and the mind, and all of that. And then there's just the sort of more basic, the higher up the social scale. You go back 100 years or 200 years. The people that did the mental work and took the decisions, were the elite, were the privileged people. I mean, all the way down to the kind of distinctions between, the office and the shop floor. I mean, white collar and blue collar, and so a lot of this is just, in a way, sort of stating the obvious. But what changed, I think, with the demise of mass industrial societies and manufacturing being 30 or 40% of an economy, was that the sort of cognitive values and sort of cognitive skills spread out from a small elite to a kind of mass elite, if you like, to 30, 40% of the population. Yeah. Now half of all school leavers, more or less, a bit less actually, nearly half of all school leavers go to university. And obviously you get diminishing returns. This is, we can come on to this. I mean, I think, one of my arguments, and I think perhaps the more original part of the argument, is that we've now reached what I call peak head, but we can come on to that in a minute. I think another reason why the kind of cognitive has swept all before it is partly because it's drawing on those traditions that I just mentioned. And also, of course, some of the most important jobs genuinely are the cognitive jobs. I mean, someone who designs a house or invents a COVID vaccine, should be more respected and better paid than someone who delivers letters or cleans offices. I mean, we don't want to be crazily egalitarian about this. But I think another factor is that cognitive ability is apparently, anyway, easy to measure. And many other kinds of ability, emotional intelligence, emotional ability, if you like, or other forms of intelligence. I mean, a sort of practical intelligence is harder to measure. And writing things on pieces of paper, dealing with essentially kind of pattern recognition, cognitive intelligence is in the kind of form of the IQ test and its various offshoots, appears to be fair. It appears to be easy to measure and it appears to be fair. Everybody reads the same biology textbook. We all sit an exam. Some of us answer the questions better than others, and that produces a simple hierarchy of ability in biology, as indeed it does. I mean, but other forms of intelligence and aptitude are much harder to capture. So I think that has certainly contributed to this sort of this gulf in status. I think this is particularly an issue in this country, partly because of the historic undervaluing, or rather, we've had a tradition that very strongly valued the practical and technical and vocational education. It's always been in a bit of a tussle with the more kind of academic traditions. I mean, I describe some of this in my book, and we've constantly been comparing ourselves to Germany back to the 1860s and the 1870s. There was that period when Germany was overtaking us in some ways in the technologies of the second industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century. I think chemical dye-stuffs was the great example. And there was a sort of pushback against this kind of Oxbridge academic tradition. But it's essentially, the Oxbridge academic tradition has sort of essentially won. And one of the ways that it won, very important ways that it won, our university sector remained absolutely tiny, even compared to other developed countries until the 1960s and 70s, really, with the Robbins report. And one of the reasons the Oxbridge tradition, or evidence for it winning, was the fact that those universities, no one really seemed to give much of a second thought to the fact that those universities were overwhelmingly residential universities, boarding universities, you like, the kind of boarding school tradition, or perhaps in this case, more accurately, the kind of Oxbridge tradition of, being a young scholar and going to Oxford or Cambridge and living there became the tradition for the whole system. There had been an alternative system there. We had the red brick universities in the industrial towns in the late 19th century developing. They tended not to be residential universities. They tended to be for local people. But that tradition got sort of defeated, if you like, by the Oxbridge tradition, which was in place in the Robbins report. And there's another thing too, which is that, and I think this, the disappearance, particularly in recent decades, the very rapid, more rapid than most other industrial countries, disappearance of industry, of manufacturing industry, means that we've lost the sort of mutual respect. I think this is one of the advantages that Germany has over it. One of the reasons why the things that I'm talking about apply to all rich countries, really, but they apply a bit less to some of the Germanic countries, partly because they have a very good alternative source of status. If you're not doing the academic thing, you're not going to university, you have the alternative. And still about 50% of school leavers in Germany do a formal, proper 3-year, 2.5, 3-year apprenticeship. And the fact that they've hung on to, industry, manufacturing industry is still 18-20% of German GDP, whereas it's 9 or 10% here. And that requires a greater mutual respect, as it were, between the academic, between the abstract intelligence and practical intelligence, to put it crudely.
On that issue that you've raised there about the role of universities and what's happened with the universities in the UK, the extraordinary thing that's happened is so many more people now go to university than did in the past. And this has, it was celebrated as a wonderful thing, the fact that so many young people can go to university. There have been questions asked about it over the past couple of decades. Do they all have to go to university? Couldn't they be doing something else? You have this extraordinary statistic in your book where you say that in the late 1970s in Sheffield, there were 45,000 steelworkers and 4,000 students. And then if you fast forward 40 years, there were 5,000 steelworkers and 60,000 students. And it's a very good snapshot of a huge epoch-defining shift that has taken place. So how important do you think, in terms of the rise of this cognitive elite and the differing values we give to individuals and the work that they do, how important do you think the explosion of university entrances was? And what would you say to those people who might say to someone like you or someone like me, if you don't want working class people going to university as much as they currently are, that's because you don't think they're cut out for that kind of life? How would you respond to those kinds of comments?
I would respond to it by saying lots of upper class people are not cut out for that kind of life either. I think the social mobility aspect of higher education is obviously one of the good things about it. We want the people who are brightest in that particular way, the people who are brightest in an academic way, from whatever background, should, so far as possible, have the opportunity to go to rigorous, academically based universities, which many of our universities have ceased to be, as part of the sort of general law of diminishing returns. But it is something that's often, it's fine for you. You went to a Russell Group university. Your children went to Russell Group universities. You're kicking away the ladder. Well, I don't want to kick away the ladder. I want the system to fit the great range of aptitudes and abilities of the British population. And actually, one of the problems with the expansion of higher education is that it is, the study of social mobility is notoriously difficult and complex, and no one knows, or it's very difficult to make confident assertions about what's been happening to social mobility. But one of the famous report on social mobility that came out in 2005, LSE academics, saying there had been a fall between the cohort of 1958 and the cohort of 1970. There had been quite a sharp fall in mobility, although actually if you looked at it, mobility was actually still surprisingly high, much higher than most people would think, between the different quartiles or quintiles, I think it was, of income. It was, I think, father-son income. But one of the reasons for the decline, they argued, they have been challenged by other people, was precisely because higher education had been so monopolized by the middle and upper middle class. And I think that continued with the great expansion post-92, when all the polytechnics became universities. So a lot of the academics who I argue with about this, obviously have their vested interest. They are academics. Yeah. They tend to be progressive. So they want to feel that the expansion of higher education has been a good thing. But I think they're in rather a difficult position. I think it's very difficult to show that there has been any positive impact on the economy thanks to the enormous expansion of higher education. The last 15 or 20 years, admittedly, it's been punctured by the financial crisis, austerity, and now COVID. But this has not been a boom period for economic growth or income growth. It's not been a boom period for innovation. It's not. It's been the opposite of a boom period for productivity. Some people indeed argue that there is a relationship between the expansion of higher education and more people doing sort of information shuffling jobs of various kinds, and that this helps to explain the decline in productivity. I don't have a strong view about that, but it's certainly very hard to argue that it's had a big economic benefit. And to the extent that social mobility tends to be a bit higher than most people imagine. It didn't fall off a cliff, as that LSE paper was interpreted as saying, but it's not the result of universities to the extent that social mobility has, whatever degree of it we have. It happens mainly because changes to the structure of the economy. There was a great demand for more graduates in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I think an expansion of the higher education system was then sensible. It was a good idea. We had the growth of the knowledge economy. You had the growth of IT. You had all sorts of the economy wanted more academically trained young people, and the structure of the economy was changing. Manual jobs were disappearing, and more white collar jobs, and indeed sort of information manipulation jobs were being created in the offices. And of course, you had computer science developing and new disciplines like that. So there was a big demand. It was perfectly rational then. But that was also the main reason for social mobility. The system demanded more better trained people. They didn't all have to go to universities. Yeah. There are lots of countries where they didn't. Switzerland, for example, many people went to much more vocational to technical type colleges. People going to sort of conventional academic, sort of 3-4 year academic full-time university courses in Switzerland remained quite small. I think remains to this day, in the sort of 25% or something. But Switzerland is not noticeably less successful economically or less socially mobile than the UK. So it's not. So universities are often claim credit for the social mobility, which is actually simply a function of the changing structure of the economy.
Are you looking for the perfect gift for the pro-freedom, anti-woke person in your life? Then look no further than the Spiked shop. You can now get your favourite Spiked slogan on a t-shirt, hoodie, tote bag or mug, including ban nothing, question everything, love Europe, hate the EU, and cancel culture. And if you're a Spike supporter, you get a 15% discount on everything in the shop. Just go to spiked-online.com/shop. to browse our items and make your purchases. That's spiked-online.com/shop. You've touched there in some of those comments on something that I think is quite important, which is, I don't know if you've had this experience, but whenever I've criticized the cult of the expert, which is, the idea that experts ought to have a greater influence on political life than ordinary people, or anyone who talks about the dominance of a cognitive elite, you will instantly be denounced as being anti-intellectual. What's your problem with clever people? What's your problem with expertise? Of course, I have no problem at all with expertise. I love experts, especially if I need an operation or if someone needs to fix my iPad. That's great. I love those people. They're wonderful. But what's striking is that the things that you describe in your book and the rise of this, I suppose, smart set, to use an old-fashioned term, it coexists with a devaluation of the genuine pursuit of knowledge and the kind of role that universities used to play, which were to be citadels of knowledge, intellectual experimentation, breaking boundaries to a certain extent, really, spending a long period of your life thinking about the world and talking about the world. And what's so striking about this new elite is that they're the clever ones, and some of them are very clever. That's absolutely true. But they have, as well as overseeing a change in how we value different working communities in the country, they've also overseen a hollowing out of the university itself. And you can see that in everything from, the very utilitarian view of education, the way in which students are now seen largely as customers. You pay your price, you get your product, and it will boost your life to this percentage and so on. Or even things like cancel culture and the censorship of controversial speakers and controversial ideas. So do you think that makes sense? I mean, it seems contradictory that these people who celebrate cleverness and the knowledge economy, it seems contradictory that they would also have overseen a devaluation of the true pursuit of knowledge. But actually, there's a logic there, isn't it? Because what we're talking about when we talk about things like the knowledge economy is something a little bit narrow in comparison to what universities would have done in the past.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I don't talk a huge amount about the kind of wokeness problem in universities, but I think there probably is a relationship between. Well, it's related to the expansion of universities, and as you say, the universities becoming a sort of production line and losing the sort of true spirit of. I mean, I think it probably still is true of some elite places, Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial, and one or two of the London universities perhaps still have some of that, real spirit of intellectual inquiry. But there's bound to be diminishing returns. I mean, unless one is to assume that the whole sort of, bell curve, as it were, of kind of, of human intellectual ability has been transformed in recent times. And there is this thing called the Flynn effect, which does say that actually IQ levels have been rising, although that effect may have worn off now. That you actually just need to be a bit smarter to survive at all in a kind of modern, complex industrial society. But assuming the bell curve hasn't really changed that much, I mean, obviously we're shifting down the bell curve when we expand university entrance. You need, anybody who wants to these days can effectively go to a university. You don't have to be intellectually able, but you're still, all the incentives are still pushing you towards university, even if you're not intellectually curious or academically able. That's what your teachers are saying. That's what your parents are probably saying, at least until recently. And we'll come on to this, but we have seen a very, very welcome shift, actually, just in the last couple of years. I think partly to do with a combination of government changing its rhetoric and people seeing the disappointing outcomes of these unavoidable diminishing returns. You're seeing it in the sort of graduate income premium. It used to be really significant. It remains really significant for people at truly elite universities, but at the run-of-the-mill universities, it's declined to almost nothing in many cases, particularly for young men. But of course, it's bound to change, and this is one of the things I object to. I mean, obviously, we need, in a sophisticated modern world, we need various forms of post-school education. I mean, that most people will require some kind of often quite intense learning period after they leave conventional secondary school. And probably a relatively small proportion of people who are really intellectually able are going and should continue to go to really rigorous institutions of higher education. But there's a whole panoply of different kinds of post-school education and training opportunities that people ought to be encouraged to take, and increasingly now are being encouraged to take, I think, partly because of this, the missing middle that I referred to right at the beginning. I mean, we have a very, very we're right at the bottom of the league table in terms of technical qualifications in the UK, as a result of which, obviously, returns to those jobs are increasing rapidly, so they're becoming much more attractive to people. But it's this narrow, it's that we massified higher education, and I think we're a bit of an international outlier in this respect. We massified higher education along the lines of elite higher education.
Yeah.
So, and this is one of the problems, that everybody's pushed into this kind of academic factory, but not doing things that might be appropriate to them. I don't know, doing a kind of 6-month or 1-year software course or coding course or something, and then going out to working for 5 or 10 years. And then perhaps if you are really interested in knowing what lies behind the stuff you've been doing, go and do a computer science degree, in your late 20s or early 30s, when you'd get far more out of it. Mm. You'd have an understanding of some aspects of it already, and you'd be able to sort of dig deeper. But as it is, we've shoved everybody, so mature students have fallen off a cliff, partly because of the funding regime. So everybody goes at 18, 19, and they all go to 3 or 4 year institutions where invariably 75, 80% are residential universities, and they're all doing abstract academic courses. Even if you're doing a construction management degree, you'll spend a lot of time doing courses on accountancy and general business studies and things like that. Whereas in the old days, you'd have done most of it probably on site. So, I mean, we're just training people in inadequate way or in inappropriate ways. I mean, or at least once you sort of get out of the real sort of cognitive elite students at the elite universities. And in other countries, you have a much greater variety of post-school education. So I think that's the problem. It's not that people shouldn't be being trained and educated after school in different disciplines, but they shouldn't all be going into the same sort of model, or essentially the kind of Oxbridge model. And this is now changing. I mean, this is one of the good news that I have to bring to you, is that people have finally seen through this, and it's partly just a kind of economic law of diminishing returns, like I mentioned. I mean, the graduate income premium has collapsed for people in kind of lower level institutions of higher education, and you're now getting, like I say, we've reached peak head. There simply isn't the demand out there. There isn't the demand from employers. But we're in a sort of transitional period, because until recently, more and more jobs were becoming graduate only. It's just one of the incentives for people to get a degree, even if they didn't really fancy it. If 40% of all jobs in the economy, and including all the best professional jobs, are graduate only, then you don't really have very much choice. If you're ambitious and want to achieve in your life. So that kind of that end of it needs to change as well. But we are seeing, there is a sense that we've reached peak head. Employers are no longer demanding it. But if you look at the stats for the professional and managerial class, upper and lower, the sort of top professional class in the country, which is obviously overwhelmingly graduates, is what universities are sort of churning people out for. The numbers have barely budged in the last 20 years. I mean, in the year 2000, the proportion of the adult working population in that category was 35%, perhaps surprisingly high, 35%. There's a kind of higher bit and a lower bit. So just over a third of the workforce were in the professional and managerial class, higher or lower. The figure for last year was 37%. It's gone up 2 percentage points in that time. And we now have a whole generation of disappointed students. Mm. And we have a generation of disappointed students with £60,000 of student debt, most of which will be handed straight back to the taxpayer, because they're never going to get jobs that will pay consistently over the 27 grand or whatever it is. And we have a lot of very frustrated people. So this is the double whammy of the overinvestment in higher education as a symbol of the sort of the over-dominance of the head and the interests of the head. In my head-hand-heart formulation, the head, which has run politics, completely taken over the Labour Party. I mean, one of the big, we can talk about the politics of this as well. The Labour Party is a liberal graduate party. It has been now for 25 years. But, one of the interests of the, to the extent one can sort of talk loosely, at least, about the kind of values and interests of this cognitive class, overlaps a bit with my, so-called anywheres, is, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of openness, autonomy. And, one of the policy ideas that they all agree on is, of course, that everybody should be like them and go to university. I mean, people accuse you and me of sort of kicking away the ladder when we say we should have fewer people. Well, my response to that is partly, well, you're just narcissistic because you want everyone to be like you.
Yeah. Well, on that very point, you talk there about how we are training people badly, and there is that diminishing return, and there will come a breaking point if it hasn't come already. But I want to take it on now a bit to the politics of this and to the political manifestations of this new situation that you're describing. And as you say, there is crossover between this book, Head, Hand, Heart, and your book, The Road to Somewhere, The New Tribes Shaping British Politics. Well, I think it has a new subtitle in subsequent editions. But anyway, your book on the tribes, The Road to Somewhere. And one of the things you talk about is that one of the clear divides between the different tribes in society, particularly between the somewheres and the anywheres, is in relation to education. It is in relation to the question of, did you go to university or did you not go to university? And if you look at polls over recent years in terms of how people vote, there are very clear dividing lines, firstly, between generations. Younger people and older people now vote very differently. We saw that in relation to Brexit. We saw it in relation to recent general elections. Older people more likely to vote Conservative, young people more likely to vote Labour. And then if you look at whether someone is a graduate or simply left school at 16, the way they vote will be very different. So, and of course, one thing that defines the older generation, people who are over 60 or over 65, is it's very unlikely they went to university. Very few people went to university back in the day. So how do you explain that? Because over the past 5 years of Brexit mayhem, I had numerous discussions with people in the media and elsewhere where they would say they would openly say the reason for this educational divide in political life is that people who are well educated understand the world better. That's why they're more likely to vote for the Labour Party. That's why they're more likely to vote Remain. They're more caring. They understand things better, and uneducated people don't. But do you think there's something very different happening, which is that universities have become not simply holding pens or places that badly train the next generation, but also institutions in which the values of this new cognitive elite are transmitted to younger people, not in a conspiratorial way. It's not as if they got together and said, let's fill them with all these beliefs that we hold. But over time, as these people have clubbed together in that part of the world, it's also become a zone in which they communicate their ideology, they develop their own in language, the way in which they understand the world, and then that has an impact on political life outside of the university too.
Yes, I think all of that is true and perhaps unavoidable. I mean, one of the kind of paradoxes, though, is that there are some people who have been very much in favour of the expansion of higher education. Indeed, one person in particular, I'm thinking of David Soskius, who was very much involved with Tony Blair's government in the original decision to go for a 50% target for higher education at the end of the 90s. And I know David, he's a good man. He's a very clever academic, and he's been involved in a lot of these decisions. He argues, I quote him actually in my book, he argues that probably the most important thing about university is not so much what you learn, which is just as well, because there are lots of studies that show, outside of a few things like medicine, university students don't actually learn anything very much. He says that more important than that is, the 3 or 4 years you spend mixing with people who are often very different to you from different social class backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds, and learning political skills, how to organize a meeting, how to whatever. There's probably already a selection effect. The kind of kids that go to university tend to be a bit more liberal anyway than the average. And actually, there is some evidence in psychology that that cleverer, I can't remember where the sort of causality goes, but so cleverer people tend to be more open and tend to be more liberal, actually. And I think that was true. And I think even allowing for the selection effects, that people who went to university tended to be better off, healthier, better educated already than the average. Nonetheless, there was a positive effect of that sort of university boarding experience in terms of, creating more liberal-minded people. And yet, where have we ended up? We've ended up with, universities sort of leading the charge towards divisiveness and tribalism and identity politics and all of that. And I mean, it may be that that's a sort of passing fad and we'll sort of come through it. So I'm not quite sure how I explain that. I mean, it may be lots of kids who are actually in the wrong place. I mean, who are struggling with their studies and therefore end up sort of putting their energy into other things while they're at university. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the whole kind of expert thing. Yeah, I mean, obviously, educated people are better just at rationalizing their own views. They're more articulate than ordinary people, and they're better at selecting the evidence to support views which are also derived essentially from their underlying values. They don't neutrally survey the evidence on leave or remain. Their values, their gut instincts, just like with ordinary people, tell them what to believe, and then they go and find the evidence to support it. And they tend to be a bit better at that than ordinary people because they know where to go and look for it.
Spiked is publishing more than ever. Articles, interviews, book reviews, long reads, podcasts. Every week, Spiked is packed with brilliant content on the big issues and big themes of our time. And now there's a really simple way for you to keep yourself in the loop on everything that we publish by signing up to our daily newsletter. In the daily newsletter, you will receive a roundup of everything we publish that day, plus some exclusive commentary from the Spiked team. What's not to like? So stay on top of everything Spiked produces by signing up for our daily newsletter today. Just go to www.spiked-online.com/newsletters. In relation to that section of society and the impact that the graduate takeover or the dominance of this new elite, the impact that it's had. You mentioned earlier the Labour Party, and I want to ask you a couple of questions about the Labour Party or what's happened to the left as we would traditionally have understood it. You're often described as someone who has made a sharp rightward turn, because you have over the years criticised open borders, criticised the Remain attempts to prevent the vote for Brexit, and criticise other aspects of political life, which apparently makes you a fascist, essentially. That's what they say. Obviously, it's complete nonsense. But I want to talk to you about Labour and the left and what's happened there, because as you said earlier, Labour has become a head party, which is ironic in many ways because it was the party that was founded in many ways to be the party of the hands, the people who worked with their hands, the people who worked hard for a living and had insufficient representation in political life. So that's been a radical transformation. And one point that you've made is that under Jeremy Corbyn, possibly ironically, the anywhere nature of the Labour Party actually intensified. So, what we were often told by Corbyn and some of his supporters is that they would have returned Labour to its older values. They would have made it a more traditional left-wing party, not like the Blairite machine and so on. But in fact, the membership under Corbyn became even more middle class than it had been under Blair. And the anywhere tendencies, that sense of a kind of openness, a suspicion of community, a suspicion of borders, a suspicion of working class values to a certain extent, those things kind of intensified. So what's your diagnosis of the Labour Party right now? Because it seems to me that the great white hope of Keir Starmer, if anything, could further intensify those problems that you and others have talked about in relation to Labour's loss of connection with rooted communities and working class communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back a long way, and it's a factor across all developed countries. Essentially, the takeover of the main party of the left by the graduate class, and most importantly, the interests and priorities of the graduate class, which are very much at odds with kind of, middle Britain or middle France or middle Germany, let alone working class Britain, France or Germany. And obviously, you've always had that in the past. I mean, political leaders are often a sort of, for want of a better term, ahead of the general population. But one of the things that's also happened in recent decades is we've actually become much more democratic as societies. I mean, the sort of residue of deference and deference to not so much kind of social class, but the deference to authority has been weakened. I mean, for both good and ill. And I think that the parties of the left have, as I say, become overwhelmingly graduate dominated amongst their activists, their MPs, their cabinet ministers. They've all, whatever their social class background, they've all had a relatively similar, or relatively homogeneous experience. And I think that's weakened them as a political force. The two main political parties have swapped in this respect, actually. University used to be for rich people, before the Second World War and even sometime after it. So the Tory party would have many more graduates than the Labour Party. And that's switch. Well, both parties are now overwhelmingly graduate. But actually, one of the advantages to the Tory party, I think, amongst its membership, is less graduate dominated. And absurd though it seems, that makes you that gives you some confidence in them that actually they're actually sort of closer to the pulse of the country, because they haven't gone through this, the politicization and liberalizing effect that, particularly if you're doing a humanities degree or a social sciences degree, a university invariably produces. So, I mean, it's an old story. I mean, the liberal graduate takeover of the left throughout the world, really, and certainly throughout the developed world, is something that's been happening for 30 years. It's sort of come to fruition more, and we've seen it very clearly in the policy priorities of parties of the left, which, just a couple of examples from the new Labour years. I mean, first of all, the 50% target for universities, and secondly, 3 or 4 years later, the decision to open our labour market to the former communist countries 7 years before we had to. No other big European country did that. And I think, that they were two very good examples of how the main party of the centre-left had completely cut itself off, really, from mainstream Britain. But I think there's also a more recent phenomenon, and you might say this lies behind things like the sort of Bernie Sanders movement in America, perhaps in a way the kind of Corbynistas here, possibly even BLM to some extent, is the frustration felt by a newer generation of students, often not from privileged backgrounds, first in their family to go to university. I mean, that is increasingly true. I mean, when higher education is expanding at the speed it has been in recent times, almost everybody is the first in their family to go to university. But the frustration felt by those people, they feel they've done the right thing, they've worked hard, they've passed their exams, they've gone to college, they come out of college, and instead of the kind of high-status professional occupation they've been led to expect, they're working some boring back office job on 22 grand. If you're a young black kid, you might blame that on racism. Perhaps racism might have something to do with it, but I think it may also be a big factor is that we have simply overexpanded the graduate class for graduate jobs that are not there. 1/3 of people leaving university now do not go into graduate jobs. And the definition of a graduate job is pretty elastic, by the way. And I think, so we're screwing the system at both ends. We're creating, a kind of lumpen intelligentsia who are disappointed because they're not getting the status that they think they deserve. So you've got a kind of angry group there. And meanwhile, we don't have enough technicians to deal with the vaccine. And so on. I mean, so we've got to readjust, and we are readjusting, actually. I mean, like I said a bit earlier, I mean, if you look at, and there have been some really encouraging opinion polls recently, which show that parents now would prefer their child to do a vocational qualification than go to university. I mean, it's a diminishing, people have noticed the diminishing returns, and they're responding to it. The kids themselves still tend to want to go, but who wouldn't want to go? Particularly the taxpayer is still ultimately paying. Who wouldn't want to go, and have fun for 3 years away from your parents and some boring suburb or small town that you live in? I mean, not everybody does want to do that, but there are a lot of people that do want to, particularly when you're 18, 19, you want to spread your wings and one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, although I haven't really got very far with it, is that is something quite valuable, even though in the context of the university, it often leads to the sort of empty radicalism that we were just talking about. But then actually, why couldn't people doing apprenticeships or doing other forms of sort of sub-degree qualification also have that opportunity? With the internet, everything is possible in a way. You could easily organise, you're going to have universities, I hope, with lots of halls of residence. This, by the way, is one of the reasons also, of course, that's been driving the expansion of higher education is the self-interest of the universities themselves. These are economic institutions as well as cultural institutions. They expand, they become richer for every student bum on every seat. And not only that, they also now have very big student accommodation estates that they need to fill. No, but there's no reason why they couldn't be filled also with residential apprenticeships. Somebody coming from Stoke to, I don't know, Bristol to do an apprenticeship. And then through the internet, you could sort of have ways of allowing everybody who is doing a kind of a residential apprenticeship in a certain area to contact each other. So you would get that same sort of mix. It's one of the good things about universities still is that they are great mixers. I mean, this is with some of the crazy politics there. It's easy to overlook that, but it is often, particularly, in parts of the country that are quite ethnically segregated, it'll often be when they go to college, say that, young Pakistanis or Bangladeshis from Bradford, will meet and befriend white people for the first time and vice versa. So I think that sort of spirit of being, the opportunity to leave home and mix with your peer group and so on, it is a valuable thing. And I think there ought to be ways in which that experience can apply to everybody without pushing everybody into this sort of sausage machine of the modern higher education system.
On that point about the readjustment taking place and the fact that more people are saying, why go to university? Why do this? And the fact that, as you described, we're reaching peak head. There isn't a huge, or there is certainly is not a growing demand for graduates to fill certain roles. We've reached a kind of a certain peak. I wanted to ask you: Am I detecting a note of optimism there? Because in terms of because what I was thinking recently is the question of how difficult, if a readjustment is taking place, how difficult this will prove to be, and possibly how conflictual it will prove to be. So one example is, you described very well the young graduates who are coming out of university who realize they've been sold a bit of a pup. They're not going to get the fantastic job they might thought they will have got. They're expressing that frustration through BLM, other kinds of movements, and so on. But what strikes me about that kind of tension in society is that this section of society often lacks the political tools to clearly express their frustrations, or even to discover who to target, who's to blame, what are the structures that are to blame for the predicament they find themselves in. So, for example, they will often fall into boomer bashing, it's old people's fault. And if you look at the way in which, at the moment, for example, lots of radical graduates around the kind of Labour Party and the Corbynista fringes, they're blaming pensioner northern homeowners, these greedy people hogging all this capital, making life difficult for us. And I wonder if identity politics and the tribes that you have written about quite a lot over the past few years, I wonder if that means that this readjustment, this recognition that the promises of the past few decades are not going to come to much good. Does the embrace of identity politics, those tribal tensions, those difficulties between different sections of society, does that mean that readjustment is going to take a conflictual form and essentially an anywhere versus somewhere form? So the anywheres will actually entrench themselves rather than asking questions about how they ended up as graduates with not very good jobs.
I mean, I don't really know is the obvious answer to that. But I mean, just bouncing off what you said, I mean, I am an optimist. I mean, I think peak head has percolated down. I mean, not so much to the HE sector itself. It's on automatic pilot. And because of the pandemic this year, there'll probably be more young kids from the UK going to university than ever before. But the political class is beginning to change, or at least the Tory part of it. So Labour is sort of stuck being the party of higher education now in some ways, as the Tories become the party of further education. And although it is true, broadly speaking, that one of the big mistakes about the expansion of higher education is as if Tony Blair hadn't realised that we don't have an alternative, for the 50% that weren't going to college. I mean, these things didn't matter when only 10 or 15% of the population went to university. 10% of your class or school went to university and you didn't. Well, who cares? You went, you left school and went to work in a local factory or office. It was fine. When 50% go and you don't, it's a completely different psychological ballgame, which nobody in the Labour leadership seemed to have any empathy towards, and perhaps because none of them were in that other 50%, and their children weren't. I mean, it was it was, I think, a very good example of why we want actually a diverse political class with people from a much bigger range of backgrounds than we've had in recent years. That those mistakes might have been avoided, but I think we are now pulling back from that. You're seeing it in the opinion polls, at least from parents. The facts are coming in. Too many kids are not getting the jobs they expected. The graduate premium is disappearing. And I think the pandemic will also have contributed to this. It's raised the status of heart jobs. Of course, many of those heart jobs still require undergraduate degrees. To be a nurse now, you require a degree. Well, it's true, there are other ways in. And indeed, one of the things I would advocate very strongly is that we should reduce, if not abolish, the number of jobs that are graduate only. And you're starting to see that too from, some of the smartest institutions, some of those originally accountancy, now sort of consultancy firms in the city, people like, what are they called? Ernst & Young and PwC and so on. They are starting to push the apprenticeship route much more. Apprenticeships are cool for the first time in many generations. And I think, you're seeing, perhaps particularly with, sort of privileged kids who are not particularly intellectual or academic, are sort of thinking, well, why should I go to some second-rate university when I could, I could set up a little company, the sort of entrepreneurial spirit. I can become a artisanal cheesemaker in Hackney. Daddy can lend me 30 grand or whatever it is. And I think that's a good thing too. Often it is the kind of, it is the rich and affluent who often set trends, and if they're starting to see, obviously not that, there are some of them who will be very intellectual and very academically inclined, but those that aren't are not feeling, as they have been over the last 30 or 40 years, feeling they kind of had to go to university because that's what everybody did. They're now starting to think, actually, it's a bit cooler not to go to university. So I think that all of that will happen. We're seeing more applications for nursing courses as a result of the pandemic. I think, which I think is a good thing. And I think it has created, despite all the cock-ups and the divisiveness and so on, I think it has created a sort of sense of national solidarity in many ways that the politics, I hope, can build on. And I think we are going to see, with AI, I'm talking about peak head is already upon us. And this is even before the arrival of AI, at least at large scale AI. And AI is going for precisely the sort of middling and lower cognitive jobs, the backroom jobs in law and accountancy and so on, that the kind of expanded university sector has been churning people out for. Yeah. So I think, we will willy-nilly sort of go back to a much smaller, much more intellectually, but I hope not socially elitist, rigorous academic university sector, with then a much greater variety of vocational type courses, full-time, part-time, for capable, able people who are not attracted to the academic route. Although, and I also think, as you were implying, that universities should also be there for people who want to kind of take a break when they're a bit older. We vastly overinvest in 18, 19-year-olds going into higher education, many of whom are simply not mature enough or interested enough to take advantage of it. Whereas when they're 30 or 35 or 40, or even when they're retired, might love to do, and then just learning for its own sake, just go and read George Eliot or learn about Sanskrit or Byzantine or, just something for the pure joy of learning about something. That's not being anti-intellectual. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I have one more final question for you, which is in relation to something you've just touched on there. So maybe you feel you've already answered it, but in relation to the COVID pandemic,
I wanted to ask you what you think the longer term impact of that will be, particularly in relation to your discussion and your theory around head, hand, heart, because the most striking thing about the pandemic, and people have commented on this, is the fact that we saw pretty well who is essential to society and who is not so essential to society in terms of work, in terms of what people do. So many people carried on working because society would not have functioned if they stopped working. And that is not just the hands people, of course, but also cognitive people, doctors and others. But significantly, lots of hand people, lots of heart people carried on working. They did not stay at home. They were not furloughed, and society would not have worked without them. Refuse collectors, for example, shelf stackers in supermarkets, nurses, and all those obvious examples. And there has been some discussion about, this has been an eye-opener for some people in terms of who keeps society running. But alongside that, there has been an intensification of some of the problems that you and I would be worried about in relation to identity politics. There was the BLM explosion. There were various attempts to interpret the pandemic as almost as being racist. It was, it was impacting on certain communities more than others, which had a tendency to undercut the national solidarity component, which was also there. So in the round, do you think there is something positive we can take from this negative experience in terms of the valuation we accord to different members of society and a sense of togetherness that has been absent from British life over the past few decades?
I definitely do, yes. I think you give a very good summary in some ways of the situation, and there are those negative caveats. This also seems to have reinforced some of the worst aspects of and most divisive aspects of identity politics. And it's also important to say, of course, that you might say, that the pandemic has been a sort of celebration of academic intelligence in some ways. The very swift creation of these vaccines has been a great triumph for highly educated, scientifically, medically educated people cooperating, usually across national boundaries, to produce these vaccines. Although actually, the vaccine in 1957 was produced even quicker, so it's not unprecedented, according to Neil Ferguson's book. But it's also important to remember, that's the kind of fact that people who are part of the great sort of, higher education sort of cognitive anywhere complex, to paraphrase Eisenhower, would take that fact and say, well, look, isn't this proof that, we need more experts, we need to send more kids to university? Absolutely not. There's absolutely no correlation between the proportion of school leavers who go to university and the degree of brilliance of your academics in laboratories. There really isn't any relationship at all. Indeed, as I was saying earlier, you don't get better innovation when you send 50% of school leavers to university compared to 25% of school leavers. Obviously, all of your brightest people are going to go to university anyway. Padding them out with a whole lot of people who probably shouldn't be there is not going to raise the level of innovation in your society. Quite possibly the opposite. And nonetheless, one has to acknowledge that this has been a great triumph for the medical part of the university sector. But at the same time, as you say, I think it has been a communitarian moment. I think this may well be sort of COVID confirmation bias, because it sort of confirms my own politics in a way, but it's been a sort of social democratic moment economically. The way that, even a conservative government has just, as in other countries, is, we've underwritten people's livelihoods on an absolutely massive scale. So it's been a hugely social democratic sort of Keynesian moment. No one seems to worry very much any longer about controlling public spending. And it's also been quite a sort of socially conservative, small c conservative moment, in that it's been very much a moment of the nation state. International institutions have not performed well, and for communities to kind of be aware of themselves again. Just in my own little patch, think of all those sort of tens of thousands of little WhatsApp groups that have sprung up so that people can look after their elderly neighbours and so on. I've got to know, a couple of old people, who live in my street who I didn't know before, and there are lots and lots of people who have done that. So I think there has been a kind of a rediscovery of community and neighbourhood and so on. And of course, we just become more aware. We've been reminded of our interdependence, really, on each other. And, your point about key workers invariably not graduates, people who stack shelves in supermarkets. We noticed them, normally, before the pandemic, we'd never noticed them. I mean, and we'll probably go back to not noticing them, but I think it'll leave a little bit of a mark. I think, I think there's some opinion polling evidence on this. It'll mean that we'll be more open to higher levels of minimum wages and so on, because many of those jobs are probably minimum wage or not much above the minimum wage. Yeah, and I think there will be some lasting effect from that. And I think the other good thing is that we've also, a lot of people have sort of rediscovered domesticity, rediscovered the family. I mean, people like Alice Thompson, who normally only write about women's issues in relation to competition with men in the professional sphere. And Madeline Bunting writes about this in her very good book about how modern feminism has in some ways been defined against sort of conventional views of care and family and so on, which is one of the problems with it. And I think the pandemic, obviously there have been some negative aspects too, increase in domestic abuse and so on. But I think, the kind of rediscovery of domesticity, people's lives slowing down a bit. A lot of people I know have talked about sort of getting to know their children again because they've been forced to spend time with them. That has sometimes been a negative experience, but more often than not, and again, the polling suggests this, it's been a positive experience. So I think all in all, there's a sort of positive small c conservatism has emerged from the pandemic. And if you combine that with the shift that's now taking place on the ending of that sort of automatic belief that that it's the head that is the only route to a satisfying life, we have a government that is now Boris Johnson's actually made some really good speeches on this. I mean, no one ever reads speeches on training, but we really do now have in place the combination of the apprenticeship levy, which is flawed in many ways, but it's there. The T levels, an alternative form of kind of A level for vocational jobs. And we now got the lifelong learning guarantee, and the state will pay anyone to get a qualification, either academic or vocational, up to level 3, the equivalent of A level. And they're also talking about allowing people to use the student loan system, not just for academic degrees, but also for vocational qualification. There is now a framework, and there's rhetoric saying that we're never going to have complete parity. I mean, the brightest people, who do invent the drugs or design beautiful buildings, will always be the people who go down the academic path. But for most of the ordinary people who are not brilliant, who go down the academic path, then they're often no more clever or able than people who don't go down the academic path. So amongst the great sort of mass of people, I think there can be a rebalancing and will be, and when indeed it's happening right now.
David Goodhart, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Brendan O'Neill Show. We'll be back with another guest and more discussion. Don't forget to subscribe, and in the meantime, keep reading Spiked at www.spiked-online.com.